Beat me at chess, and I'll give you $100 million. The billionaire smirked, but when the maid's daughter lifted a pawn, his empire began to tremble. It's a game for intellect, not simple people. The billionaire's laugh shattered the silence of the library, echoing against marble floors and shelves lined with first editions. His name was Preston Montgomery, Wall Street legend, empire builder, a man who had never lost. Before him stood Susan Miller, a maid too timid to answer back, and her daughter Abigail, only 9 years old. A child. A whisper of defiance. "My mother may not play, sir, but I do." Gasps followed. Investors, rivals, and servants alike held their breath as Preston smirked, tapping the ivory king between his fingers. "You? A child? Fine then. Beat me, and I'll give you $100 million. Lose, and your mother is gone forever." The pieces were set, and the world was watching. A king is just a piece of wood, until a child makes it a weapon. He thought the game was against a simple maid, a woman he could easily crush. But he never saw the 9-year-old girl with old eyes, standing in her mother's shadow. The grand library of the Montgomery estate was a silent, imposing place. It was filled with the scent of old leather and expensive wood polish. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. This room was the heart of Preston Montgomery's world. It was a testament to his power, his intellect, and his wealth. Every book was a first edition. Every painting was an original. And in the center of the room, on a marble pedestal, sat a magnificent chess set. The pieces were carved from ivory and obsidian. The board was a polished slab of jade and marble. It was a museum piece, a collector's item. It was also a battlefield. Preston Montgomery, a man who had conquered Wall Street and built a global empire from nothing, loved the game of chess. He loved its logic, its strategy, and its cold, unforgiving nature. For him, life was a chess game, and he had never lost. Today, however, the hallowed silence of his library was disturbed. Susan Miller, his housekeeper, was carefully dusting the bookshelves. She was a quiet, unassuming woman in her late 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her hands chapped and worn from years of hard work. Her daughter, a small, 9-year-old girl named Abigail, sat quietly in a corner, reading a book. Abigail had her mother's kind eyes, but her hair was a cascade of bright, shining gold. She was a small, silent presence in a room that was not meant for children. Preston Montgomery entered the library with a thunderous scowl on his face. He was a tall, imposing man in his early 50s, with a mane of silver hair and eyes as sharp and cold as a winter sky. He had just finished a brutal conference call, a deal that had gone sour. He was in a foul mood, looking for someone to blame, someone to belittle. His eyes landed on Susan. "You?" he barked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Are you finished yet? I need to think. I can't think with you flitting about like a nervous bird." Susan flinched. "I'm almost done, Mr. Montgomery. Just this last shelf." Preston's eyes narrowed. He walked over to the chess set, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. He picked up the black king, turning it over in his hand. "Do you play chess, Susan?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Susan shook her head. "No, sir. I never learned." Preston laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Of course, you didn't. It's a game of intellect, of strategy. It requires a certain kind of mind. A mind that can see 10 moves ahead. A mind that can anticipate and dominate." He placed the king back on its square with a decisive click. "It's not a game for simple people." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Susan's face flushed with shame. She wanted to be invisible, to disappear into the woodwork. But she couldn't. She had a daughter to think of. She had bills to pay. So she swallowed her pride and said nothing. But Abigail had heard. She had seen the flash of pain in her mother's eyes. She closed her book and stood up. Her small voice, clear and steady, cut through the tense silence. "My mother may not play, sir," she said, "but I do." Preston Montgomery turned, his eyebrows raised in amusement. He looked down at the small, blonde girl, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You," he said, "a child? And what do you know of chess?" "I know that it's not about how smart you are," Abigail replied, her gaze unwavering. "It's about how well you understand the pieces, and how much you're willing to sacrifice to protect your king." Preston was taken aback by her words, by the quiet confidence in her voice. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. It was a spark of intelligence, a depth that seemed out of place in a child of her age. For a moment, he was intrigued, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. Is that so? He sneered. Well, then, little girl, let's see what you've got. Let's play a game. He gestured to the magnificent chess set. You and me. Right now. Susan rushed forward, her face pale with worry. Mr. Montgomery, please. She's just a child. She didn't mean to be disrespectful. Preston waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. The child wants to play. Let her play. Or is she afraid? He looked at Abigail, a challenge in his eyes. What's the matter, little girl? Are you all talk? Abigail looked at her mother, then back at the billionaire. I'm not afraid, she said softly. A wicked glint appeared in Preston's eyes. He saw an opportunity for a bit of cruel sport, a way to vent his frustrations. He would crush this child, humiliate her, and teach her and her mother a lesson in humility. All right then, he said, a wide, malicious grin spreading across his face. Let's make it interesting. A little wager. He leaned in, his voice a low, theatrical whisper. If you win, he said, drawing out the words for maximum effect, I'll give you $100 million. The room fell silent. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sum was so vast, so astronomical, that it sounded like a joke. But Preston Montgomery was not joking. His face was a mask of smug certainty. He let the offer hang in the air for a moment, savoring the shock and disbelief on Susan's face. Then, he delivered the punchline. But when you lose, he continued, his voice turning to ice, your mother is fired, and you will never set foot in this house again. He leaned back, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had backed them into a corner. He had made an offer they couldn't refuse, and a threat they couldn't ignore. The game was set. The pieces were in place, and Preston Montgomery was already savoring his victory. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated his opponent. He had looked at Abigail and seen a small, insignificant child. He had not seen the mind behind her eyes, a mind that had been forged in the crucible of a forgotten war, a mind that had been taught the art of strategy by a master of the game. He had not seen the ghost of a war hero, a man who had faced down death and laughed in its face, a man whose blood ran in the veins of the small, blonde girl who now stood before him, ready to play. The game was about to begin, and the billionaire's world was about to be turned upside down. Abigail's grandfather, Frank, was a man who had seen the world in black and white, not in terms of morality, but in the stark, unforgiving squares of a chessboard. He was a veteran of the Korean War, a man who had spent his youth in the frozen hills of a foreign land, fighting a war that few understood. He had come home a quiet, solitary man, with a mind that was always working, always calculating. He had found solace in the game of chess. It was a world of pure logic, of cause and effect. There was no room for emotion, no place for luck. It was a battle of wills, a test of intellect. And Frank was a grandmaster, not in any official sense. He had never played in a tournament, never sought a ranking. But he had studied the game with a fierce, obsessive passion. He had devoured every book, analyzed every famous match, and played thousands of games against himself, a solitary warrior in a silent war. When Abigail was born, something in Frank had softened. He saw in his granddaughter a kindred spirit, a mind that was as sharp and curious as his own. He began to teach her the game when she was just 5 years old. He didn't use a fancy, expensive set like Preston Montgomery's. He used an old, battered wooden board, with pieces that were worn smooth from years of use. He didn't teach her openings or memorized lines of attack. He taught her the soul of the game. He taught her to see the board as a living thing, a landscape of possibilities. He taught her to understand the personality of each piece, its strengths and its weaknesses. The pawn, he would say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, is the soul of chess. It looks weak, insignificant, but it has the potential to become a queen. It can change the course of the game. Never underestimate the pawn, Abby. Never underestimate the little guy. He taught her about sacrifice, about giving up a valuable piece to gain a strategic advantage. Sometimes, he would say, his eyes distant, you have to lose a battle to win the war. You have to be willing to let go of something you love for the greater good. He taught her to think like her opponent, to get inside their head, to understand their fears and their desires. Every player has a style, he explained. a rhythm, a tell. You have to listen to the game, Abby. It will tell you everything you need to know about the person sitting across from you. Abigail had absorbed his lessons like a sponge. She had a natural aptitude for the game, an intuitive understanding of its complexities. She could see patterns that others missed, calculate variations with a speed that was almost supernatural. By the time she was 7, she was regularly beating her grandfather. Frank had been an old man by then, his body failing, but his mind as sharp as ever. He had made Abigail a promise. "One day, Abby," he had said, his voice weak, but his eyes bright with love, "you're going to use this game to do something great. You're going to show the world that it's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog." He had passed away a year later, leaving Abigail with a broken heart and a deep, abiding love for the game of chess. She had not played since his death. The old wooden board was tucked away in her closet, a painful reminder of the man she had lost. But now, standing in the grand library of the Montgomery estate, her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. She looked at the arrogant billionaire, at the smug, cruel smile on his face. She saw the fear and shame in her mother's eyes. And she knew that this was the moment her grandfather had been talking about. This was her chance to do something great. This was her chance to fight. Abigail took a deep breath and walked over to the magnificent chessboard. She pulled up a chair and sat down, her small frame almost dwarfed by the massive, ornate table. Preston Montgomery sat across from her, a look of amused contempt on his face. "The child wants to play with the white pieces," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A fitting choice. The color of innocence, of surrender." Abigail said nothing. She simply reached out and made her first move. Pawn to e4. A classic opening. Solid. Unassuming. The beginning of a million different stories. Preston responded immediately, his movements quick and aggressive. He was a player who liked to dominate, to control the board from the very beginning. He brought out his knights and his bishops, launching an early attack, trying to overwhelm her with his superior forces. But Abigail was not intimidated. She met his aggression with a quiet, patient defense. She developed her pieces slowly, carefully, building a solid, impenetrable fortress around her king. She was a rock in the face of his storm, a silent, immovable object. The game continued, a silent, deadly dance of ivory and obsidian. The clock ticked on the mantelpiece, the only sound in the tense, quiet room. Susan stood by the door, her hands clasped in a silent prayer. She didn't understand the game, but she understood the stakes. Her entire world hung in the balance. Preston grew impatient. He was used to his opponents crumbling under his relentless pressure. But this child, this small, silent girl, was different. She made no mistakes. She gave him no openings. She was a wall, a fortress, a puzzle he couldn't solve. He decided to change tactics. He would use his favorite weapon, the one that had served him so well in the boardroom and in life, psychological warfare. He began to talk, his voice a low, insidious whisper. "You're in over your head, little girl," he said, his eyes fixed on the board. "You think you can compete with me? I've been playing this game longer than you've been alive. I've crushed men who would make you tremble." Abigail said nothing. She simply made her move. "Your mother must be very proud," Preston continued, his voice laced with venom. "Raising a daughter who gambles with her livelihood. A daughter who would see her thrown out on the street, all for a silly game." Susan flinched, a tear rolling down her cheek. But Abigail remained impassive. Her eyes were fixed on the board, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. Preston leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'll make you a deal, little girl. Forfeit the game now, and I'll let your mother keep her job. I'll even forget this whole embarrassing incident. It will be our little secret." He smiled, a wolfish, predatory grin. He thought he had her. He had offered her an escape, a way out. He had appealed to her love for her mother, to her sense of guilt. But he had misjudged her yet again. He had mistaken her silence for fear. He had mistaken her patience for weakness. He had mistaken her love for her mother as a vulnerability he could exploit. Abigail finally looked up from the board. She met his gaze, her blue eyes as clear and cold as a mountain lake. "It is your move, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Preston Montgomery felt a flicker of doubt. He looked at the small, blonde girl across from him, and he saw something he had never seen before. He saw a will that was as strong as his own. He saw a mind that was as sharp as his own. He saw a warrior. The game had just begun, and the billionaire was starting to sweat. The atmosphere in the library grew heavier with each passing minute. The sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the room. The only light came from a single, ornate lamp on a nearby table, which cast a golden glow on the chessboard, turning the game into a stark, dramatic tableau. Preston was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of intense concentration, his brow furrowed, his jaw clenched. He was no longer playing with a child. He was in a real fight, a fight for his pride, his reputation, and he was beginning to realize, for something more. He had thrown everything he had at her. He had used all of his favorite tricks, all of his most cunning traps. But she had seen through them all. She had anticipated his every move, countered his every attack. It was like playing against a ghost, a mind that was always one step ahead of his own. He was beginning to understand. This was not just a game of chess. It was a battle of philosophies. He was a player who believed in power, in brute force, in the relentless accumulation of material advantage. He was a king who sent his armies to conquer and destroy. Abigail, on the other hand, played with a quiet, subtle grace. She was a master of position, of harmony, of the slow, patient accumulation of small advantages. She was a queen who protected her people, who built a kingdom that was strong and resilient. Her pieces worked together, a symphony of coordinated movement. His were a collection of individual soldiers, fighting a war they didn't understand. He looked across the board at her, and he felt a grudging respect, mixed with a growing sense of dread. He had never been in a position like this before. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of the engagement. But now, he was the one on the defensive, the one reacting to her moves, the one being slowly, inexorably squeezed. He thought back to his own childhood. He had learned to play chess from his father, a cold, ruthless man who had taught him that winning was the only thing that mattered. His father had been a corporate raider, a man who had built his fortune by tearing other companies apart. He had taught Preston to be a shark, to smell blood in the water, to never show mercy. He had learned his lessons well. He had become a man who was feared, but not loved. He had a string of failed marriages, and a son he barely knew. He had a life that was filled with expensive things, but empty of any real meaning. He looked at Abigail, at the quiet dignity in her posture, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw a child who was loved, a child who was fighting for something more than just money or pride. She was fighting for her mother, for her grandfather's memory, for a world where the little guy could win. And he felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion. He felt a pang of envy. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He could not afford to be sentimental. He was Preston Montgomery. He did not lose. He focused on the board, searching for a way out, a weakness he could exploit. And then he saw it. A desperate, risky move. A gambit. He would sacrifice his queen, his most powerful piece, to lure her king into a trap. It was a move born of desperation, a move that would either win him the game in a blaze of glory, or lead to his swift and utter defeat. He picked up his queen, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at Abigail, expecting to see a flicker of surprise, of uncertainty. But her expression was unreadable. She was as calm and still as a frozen lake. He made the move, placing his queen in the line of fire. The bait was set. Abigail looked at the board for a long, silent moment. She saw the trap, of course. She saw the tempting prize and the hidden danger that lay behind it. She knew that her grandfather would have been proud of her. He had taught her to be a cautious player, to never take unnecessary risks. But he had also taught her something else. He had taught her that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Sometimes you have to be brave. Sometimes you have to be a lion. She reached out and took his queen. A gasp escaped Susan's lips. Preston's eyes widened in triumph. He had her. He had fallen for his trap. He launched his counterattack, a swift and brutal assault on her exposed king. His rooks and his knights descended on her position, a storm of fury and fire. Check, check, check. Her king was forced to move, to flee across the board, a hunted animal. Preston's victory seemed certain. He had her on the ropes. He was just one move away from checkmate. He leaned back in his chair, a cruel, triumphant smile returning to his face. "It's over, little girl," he said, his voice a low, gloating purr. "You fought well. But in the end, the king always wins." He reached out to make his final, winning move. But then he stopped. He had seen something. Something impossible. He looked at the board again, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been so focused on his own attack, so blinded by his own arrogance, that he had missed it. He had missed the quiet, subtle, brilliant move that she had made 3 turns ago. He had been so focused on her king that he had forgotten about her pawns. And one of her pawns, one of her small, insignificant, underestimated pawns, had been slowly, quietly, marching up the board, unnoticed, unheeded. And now, it stood on the brink of his own back rank, 1 square away from becoming a queen. His blood ran cold. He saw it all, in a flash of sickening clarity. His attack was a sham. His victory was an illusion. He had been so busy hunting her king that he had left his own kingdom undefended. She had not fallen into his trap. She had set her own, a trap that was deeper, more subtle, and far more deadly than his own. She had sacrificed her queen, not out of greed, but out of a cold, calculating brilliance. She had given him a prize, to distract him, to blind him, while she moved her real weapon into position. He looked up at her, his face pale, his heart pounding in his chest. Abigail met his gaze, her expression unreadable. And then, she made her final move. Pawn to D1. The pawn, the small, insignificant pawn, had reached the end of the board. And it had become a queen. A new queen. A second queen. A queen that was now pointed like a dagger at the heart of his kingdom. "Checkmate," she said, her voice a soft, quiet whisper that was louder than a thunderclap. The game was over. The billionaire had lost. And the world had turned upside down. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Preston Montgomery stared at the chessboard, his face as white as a sheet. His mind, usually so quick, so sharp, was a jumble of confused thoughts. He had lost. The words echoed in his head, a mantra of disbelief. He, Preston Montgomery, had lost a game of chess to a 9-year-old girl, the daughter of his housekeeper. He had been so certain of his victory. He had been so arrogant, so dismissive. He had played with a cruel, casual confidence, toying with her, mocking her, savoring his inevitable triumph. And she had destroyed him. She had played with a quiet, patient brilliance that had dismantled his every attack, unraveled his every strategy. She had been a ghost, a phantom, a mind that he could not comprehend. He looked up at her, at the small, blonde girl who sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was not gloating. She was not smiling. She was simply watching him, her blue eyes filled with a strange, unsettling wisdom. And in that moment, he felt a wave of shame so profound, so overwhelming, that it almost brought him to his knees. He had not just lost a game of chess. He had lost a piece of himself. He had lost the arrogant certainty that had been the bedrock of his life. He had been a bully. He had been a monster. He had threatened a single mother and tried to humiliate a child. And he had failed. He finally found his voice, a hoarse, strangled whisper. "How?" he asked. "How did you do that?" Abigail's expression softened. "You taught me," she said, her voice gentle. "I taught you," he repeated, confused. "You said that chess was a game of intellect," she explained. "But it's not. It's a game of understanding. You understand power. You understand how to attack, how to dominate. But you don't understand sacrifice. You don't understand teamwork. You don't understand that sometimes the smallest piece can be the most important." She pointed to the pawn on the back rank, the pawn that had become a queen. "You never saw her coming," she said. "You were so busy looking at the big pieces, the powerful pieces, that you forgot about the little one." Her words were not an accusation. They were a simple statement of fact, but they hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his entire life looking at the big pieces. He had amassed a fortune, built an empire, conquered the world. But he had forgotten about the little things. He had forgotten about kindness, about compassion, about love. He looked at Susan, who was now standing by her daughter's side, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, relief, and a fierce, protective pride. He had treated this woman with such contempt, such disdain. He had seen her as nothing more than a servant, a piece of furniture. But she was a mother. She was a woman who had raised a daughter of such extraordinary talent and such profound grace. He had made a bet. A ridiculous, arrogant, insane bet. $100 million. The words hung in the air, a monument to his own foolishness. He was a man of his word. He had never broken a promise, never backed out of a deal. But this was different. This was a child. This was a housekeeper. To give them that much money would be to change their lives forever. It would also be to admit his own defeat, his own humiliation, on a scale that was almost unimaginable. He was Preston Montgomery. He was a man who did not lose. He could find a way out of this. He could claim it was a joke. He could hire an army of lawyers to tie them up in court for years. He could crush them, just as he had crushed so many others. He looked at Abigail again, and he saw her grandfather in her eyes. He saw the quiet strength, the unwavering integrity, the deep, abiding love for the game. He saw a man who had fought for his country, a man who had lived a life of honor and purpose. And he knew what he had to do. It was the hardest decision of his life. It was a move that went against every instinct, every fiber of his being. But he knew, with a certainty that was as clear and cold as a winter morning, that it was the right one. He took a deep breath. He stood up. He extended his hand. "You won, Abigail," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Fair and square. A deal is a deal." Susan Miller watched, frozen, as Preston Montgomery's hand remained outstretched in the silent room. It was a large, powerful hand, a hand that had signed billion-dollar deals and crushed competitors without a second thought. Now, it was offered to her 9-year-old daughter in a gesture of surrender. Abigail looked at the offered hand, then up at the billionaire's pale face. She saw the storm in his eyes, the confusion, the shame, the dawning of a reluctant respect. She did not take his hand. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of triumph, but of acknowledgement. The game was over. The debt was settled. Preston slowly lowered his hand, feeling a fresh wave of embarrassment. Of course, she wouldn't shake his hand. Why would she? He had been a monster to her and her mother. The handshake was a custom among equals, and he had treated them as anything but. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the library. "My assistant will be in touch with you, Susan," he said, his voice strained and formal, "to arrange the transfer of the funds. I will need your banking information." Susan could only nod, her mind a complete blank. Banking information? Funds? The words seemed to belong to another language, another world. $100 million. The number was so vast, so impossibly large, that her brain refused to process it. It was like trying to imagine the size of the universe. "You are dismissed for the day," Preston added, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. He turned away, unable to look at them any longer. He walked over to the tall windows and stared out at the meticulously manicured gardens, but he saw nothing. All he could see was the chessboard in his mind, the silent, brilliant moves of the small girl who had so utterly and completely defeated him. Susan gently took Abigail's hand. It felt so small and fragile in her own. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's go home." She practically ran from the library, pulling Abigail along with her. She didn't stop until they were outside, standing in the long, gravel driveway. The cool evening air a welcome shock to her senses. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, velvety purple, dotted with the first stars of the evening. They walked home in silence. Their small apartment was only a few blocks from the Montgomery estate, in a neighborhood that was a world away in every other respect. The buildings were older, the streets were narrower, and the air was filled with the sounds of everyday life, the laughter of children, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of televisions from open windows. When they were finally inside their own small, cozy living room, Susan collapsed onto the sofa, her body shaking. The reality of what had just happened began to crash down on her like a tidal wave. "Abby," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What did you do?" Abigail sat down beside her, her expression calm and serene. "I played a game of chess, Mom." "But, the money," Susan stammered. $100 million. He can't be serious. He won't actually give it to us, will he? "He will," Abigail said with a quiet certainty. "He's a man who understands rules. And he lost. He has to pay." Susan stared at her daughter, at this small, familiar person who had suddenly become a stranger. She had always known that Abigail was smart. She was a quiet, observant child, a straight A, a student who preferred books to playgrounds. But this was something else entirely. This was a level of intelligence, of strategic thinking, that was almost frightening. Where did you learn to play like that? Susan asked, her voice filled with awe. Your grandfather? He taught you, didn't he? Abigail nodded. He taught me everything. But, like that? He was just an old man who liked to play in the park. He was more than that, Mom, Abigail said softly. He was a general. He just never had an army. Susan didn't understand what she meant, but she was too exhausted, too overwhelmed, to ask. She pulled her daughter into a tight hug, burying her face in her soft, blonde hair. I was so scared, she sobbed. I thought we were going to lose everything. We were never going to lose, Abigail said, her small arms wrapped around her mother's neck. Grandpa taught me how to win. That night, Susan couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The number kept repeating itself in her head. $100 million. It was a life-changing sum of money. It was freedom. It was a new house, a new car, a college education for Abigail, a future free from worry and struggle. But it was also terrifying. It was a weight, a responsibility, a target on their backs. How could they, a simple housekeeper and her 9-year-old daughter, possibly manage that kind of money? What would people say? What would they do? She thought about Preston Montgomery. She had worked for him for 3 years. She had seen him at his best and at his worst. She had seen his flashes of generosity, rare though they were. But she had also seen his cruelty, his arrogance, his utter disregard for the feelings of others. And yet, she had seen something else today. She had seen him humbled. She had seen him defeated. And in that moment of defeat, she had seen a flicker of something she had never seen before. A flicker of humanity. Meanwhile, in his grand, empty mansion, Preston Montgomery was also awake. He sat in his library, the chessboard still set up on the marble pedestal. He stared at the pieces, at the final, impossible position that had led to his downfall. He had replayed the game in his mind 100 times, and each time, he was left with the same conclusion. He had been outplayed. Not just outmaneuvered, but outthought, outplanned, outwitted. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their motivations, to predict their actions. But he had been completely blind to the true nature of the small, quiet girl who had sat across from him. He had seen a child. He had not seen the mind of a grandmaster. Who was she? Where had she come from? He picked up his phone and called his head of security, a man named Henderson who had been with him for 20 years. Henderson was a former FBI agent, a man who could find a needle in a haystack, a ghost in a machine. Henderson, Preston said, his voice low and urgent. I have a job for you. I want you to find out everything you can about my housekeeper, Susan Miller, and her daughter, Abigail. Is there a problem, sir? Henderson asked, his voice calm and professional. No problem, Preston said. Just a curiosity. I want to know about their family, their history, their background. I want to know about the girl's father. I want to know about her grandfather. I want to know everything. And I want it on my desk by morning. He hung up the phone and stared back at the chessboard. He was a man who did not believe in mysteries. He believed in facts, in data, in the cold, hard logic of the bottom line. And he was determined to solve the mystery of Abigail Miller. He was determined to understand the mind of the child who had brought him to his knees. He had a feeling, a deep, unsettling feeling, that this was more than just a game of chess. He felt that his life, in some fundamental way, had just been irrevocably changed. The next morning, a thick manila envelope was waiting on Preston's desk. He opened it with a sense of trepidation. Inside was a detailed report on the life of Susan Miller. It was a simple, unremarkable story. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio. She had been a good student, a quiet girl who had never been in any trouble. She had married her high school sweetheart, a man named David Miller, who had been killed in a car accident when Abigail was just a baby. She had moved to the city a few years later, looking for work, and had been employed at the Montgomery estate ever since. It was a story of quiet struggle, of resilience, of a mother's love. It was a story that, on any other day, Preston would have dismissed as sentimental and irrelevant. But today, it felt different. It felt real. He turned the page to the section on Abigail's grandfather, Frank Miller. And that's when he saw it. A black and white photograph, taken sometime in the 1950s. It was a picture of a young man in an army uniform, with a square jaw and a serious, intelligent gaze. Preston stared at the photograph, his blood turning to ice. He knew that face. He had seen it before, in old, faded photographs from his own family's history. He stood up and walked over to a locked cabinet in the corner of his library. He opened it with a key that he kept on his person at all times. Inside was a collection of old photo albums, a history of the Montgomery family in leather-bound volumes. He pulled out an album from the 1970s. He flipped through the pages, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he found it. A picture of his father, a younger, more ruthless version of himself, standing in front of a small, brick factory building. And standing next to him, looking uncomfortable and out of place in a cheap suit, was Frank Miller. The name of the factory was printed on a sign above the door, Miller & Sons Precision Tools. And suddenly, it all came rushing back to him. The stories his father used to tell, late at night, over a glass of expensive whiskey. Stories of his early days, of his first conquests, of the deals that had laid the foundation for the Montgomery Empire. The first rule of business, son, his father had said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light, is that there are no rules. You take what you want. You crush your competition. You never, ever, show mercy. His first major acquisition had been a small, family-owned tool and die company in Ohio. A company called Miller & Sons. He had bought it for a song, stripped it of its assets, fired all of its employees, and sold the land to a developer. It was a classic corporate raid, a textbook example of the kind of ruthless, predatory capitalism that had made his father a legend. And Frank Miller, he had been the son, the one who had tried to fight back, the one who had refused to sell, who had appealed to his father's sense of decency, of fairness, a sense that his father had never possessed. Preston remembered his father laughing about it. The man was a fool, he had said. He talked about loyalty, about tradition, about the families who had worked for his father for generations. I told him that loyalty was a weakness, that tradition was a boat anchor, and that families were just another line item on a balance sheet. Frank Miller had lost everything. His company, his inheritance, his father's legacy. He had been ruined, cast aside, a forgotten casualty in the relentless march of the Montgomery Empire. Preston sank into his chair, the photo album open on his lap. He looked from the picture of his father, with his cold, triumphant smile, to the picture of the young soldier, with his proud, honest eyes. And he finally understood. Abigail's victory had not been a fluke. It had not been a lucky guess. It had been justice. It had been a ghost from the past, returning to claim a debt that had been owed for 50 years. The $100 million, it was not a wager. It was a restitution. It was a long overdue payment for a life that had been broken, a legacy that had been stolen. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the library pressing in on him. He thought about his own life, about the empire he had inherited, the fortune he had built. He had always been proud of his success, of his ability to win, to dominate, to conquer. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of it. He felt the ghosts of the people his family had crushed, the lives they had destroyed, the dreams they had extinguished. He had been playing a game of chess his entire life. But he had been playing with the wrong pieces. He had been playing for the wrong prize. He knew what he had to do. It was not enough to simply give them the money. He had to do more. He had to try, in some small, inadequate way, to make things right. He picked up the phone. He did not call his assistant. He did not call his lawyers. He called the main number for the Montgomery estate. "Get me Susan Miller's home phone number," he said, his voice quiet, but firm. "I need to speak with her." The phone rang in the small apartment, a shrill, jarring sound that made Susan jump. She had been trying to read a magazine, but the words were just a blur. She couldn't concentrate. She couldn't think. She let it ring, her heart pounding. Who could be calling? No one ever called her. Finally, on the fourth ring, she picked it up. "Hello," she said, her voice hesitant. "Susan? It's Preston Montgomery." Susan's blood ran cold. She stood up, her hand gripping the receiver so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Is everything all right?" "I need to see you," he said. "You and Abigail. I'd like to come over. To your home. If that's all right." Susan was stunned into silence. Preston Montgomery, in her small, humble apartment? The idea was so preposterous, so unimaginable that she didn't know how to respond. "It's about the money," he said, his voice softer now, less commanding. "But it's about more than that. It's about your father-in-law. It's about Frank." Susan's heart skipped a beat. Frank? What did he know about Frank? "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said, and then he hung up. Susan stood there, the dead receiver in her hand, her mind reeling. She looked at Abigail, who was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing in her sketchbook. "Abby," she said, her voice trembling. "Mr. Montgomery is coming here." Abigail looked up, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said. And in that moment, Susan knew that her daughter had known all along. She had known who Preston Montgomery was. She had known about the history, about the connection, about the ancient, unhealed wound that had been festering for half a century. The game had not started yesterday, in the grand library of the Montgomery estate. It had started 50 years ago, in a small, brick factory in Ohio. And it had finally, after all these years, reached its endgame. 30 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Susan took a deep breath and opened it. Preston Montgomery stood there, not in one of his expensive, custom-made suits, but in a simple pair of slacks and a polo shirt. He looked smaller, somehow, less intimidating, without the armor of his wealth and power. He held a large, leather-bound photo album in his hands. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Susan nodded and stepped aside. He walked into their small living room, his eyes taking in the worn furniture, the framed pictures on the wall, the sense of warmth and love that filled the small space. It was a world away from his own cold, empty mansion. He saw Abigail, sitting at the kitchen table, watching him with her old, wise eyes. He walked over to the table and placed the photo album on it. He opened it to the page with the picture of his father and Frank Miller, standing in front of the factory. "I think you know what this is," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, somber regret. Abigail looked at the picture, then up at him. She said nothing. "My father," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly, "was a thief. He stole your grandfather's company. He stole his legacy. He stole his life." He looked at Susan, his eyes filled with a raw, unvarnished shame. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to you, I didn't know. Not until this morning." He took a deep breath. "The $100 million, he said. "It's not enough. It's not nearly enough to repay the debt that my family owes yours. But it's a start." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. It was not a check. It was a series of documents, legal papers, drawn up by his lawyers that morning. "I've arranged for the transfer of the funds," he said. "But I've also done something else. I've set up a trust in your grandfather's name, the Frank Miller Foundation. It will be dedicated to helping small, family-owned businesses, to protecting them from predatory corporations, from men like my father." He pushed the documents across the table. "I want you and Abigail to run it," he said. "I want you to use my family's money to undo the damage that my family has done." Susan stared at the documents, her eyes filling with tears. She was not just a housekeeper anymore. She was the head of a foundation. She was a guardian of a legacy. Preston looked at Abigail. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice filled with a deep and profound respect, "was a better man than my father. And you are a better player than I am." He extended his hand again. This time, Abigail took it. Her small hand was lost in his, but her grip was firm, steady. "The game is not over, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It's just beginning." And in that small, humble apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the possibilities of the future, a billionaire and a maid's daughter shook hands. A debt had been paid, a wound had been healed, and a new game, a better game, was about to begin. A game where the little guy, the underestimated pawn, could not only win, but could change the world. From that day on, nothing was the same. The money was transferred, a silent, digital river flowing from one world to another. Susan quit her job, not with anger or resentment, but with a quiet dignity. She and Abigail moved out of their small apartment and bought a modest but comfortable house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a home. It had a backyard where Abigail could play and a study where Susan could begin her new life's work. The Frank Miller Foundation became her passion. She threw herself into it with a fierce, determined energy. She hired a small staff, and together, they began to sift through the applications that poured in from all over the country. They were stories of struggle, of hope, of people who were trying to build something of their own, something that would last. She became a champion for the underdog, a defender of the small, family-owned businesses that were the backbone of the country. She used the Montgomery fortune, the fortune that had been built on the ruins of her own family's legacy, to give other families a fighting chance. Preston Montgomery, for his part, began a slow and painful process of transformation. He did not retire. He did not sell his company, but he began to run it differently. He started to think about more than just the bottom line. He started to think about the people who worked for him, about the communities his company affected, about the legacy he would leave behind. He became a major benefactor of the Frank Miller Foundation, not just with his money, but with his time and his expertise. He mentored young entrepreneurs. He advised small business owners. He used his vast network of contacts to open doors for people who had never had a chance. He and Abigail continued to play chess. They met once a month, in a quiet corner of a public park, on a simple, battered wooden board. He never beat her, but he learned from her. He learned about patience, about sacrifice, about the quiet, subtle power of a well-played endgame. He learned that winning wasn't everything. He learned that sometimes, the greatest victories come from the games you lose. One crisp, autumn afternoon, as they were finishing a game, Preston looked at Abigail, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. My company, it's just a collection of assets, of brands, of balance sheets. It has no soul. It has no purpose. It's just a machine for making money." He paused, and then he said, "I'd like you to be on my board of directors." Abigail looked up from the board, her blue eyes serious. She was 10 years old now, on the cusp of a new world, a new life. "I don't know anything about business," she said. "You know everything you need to know," he replied. "You know that the pawn is the soul of chess. You know that the little guy matters. You know that you have to be willing to sacrifice something you love for the greater good." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I need you, Abigail," he said. "I need you to help me play a better game." And so, the story of the billionaire and the maid's daughter came to a close. But it was also a beginning. It was the beginning of a new legacy, a new kind of empire, one that was built not on ruthless ambition, but on compassion, on justice, and on the quiet, enduring wisdom of a 9-year-old girl who knew how to play chess. The world is a chessboard, and we are all just pieces trying to find our way home. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we find a grandmaster, a teacher, a friend, who shows us how to play the game with grace, with courage, and with love. And that, in the end, is the only victory that truly matters. The appointment of a 10-year-old girl to the board of directors of a multi-billion-dollar corporation was, to put it mildly, unprecedented. It sent shockwaves through the financial world. The headlines were a mixture of ridicule and disbelief. "Montgomery's madness," one newspaper blared. "Billionaire appoints child prodigy to board," another announced, with a healthy dose of skepticism. The board members themselves, a collection of grizzled, hard-nosed executives who had clawed their way to the top of the corporate ladder, were aghast. They saw it as an insult, a publicity stunt, a sign that the old man was finally losing his mind. But Preston Montgomery didn't care. He had spent his entire life caring about what other people thought, about maintaining his image of ruthless invincibility. Now, he cared only about one thing: redemption. The first board meeting with Abigail in attendance was a scene of high comedy and simmering tension. She sat at the long, polished mahogany table, her feet not quite reaching the floor, a glass of milk placed beside her by a bewildered assistant. She was flanked by men who were 3 times her height and 50 years her senior. They spoke in a language of acronyms and financial jargon, of leveraged buyouts and quarterly earnings reports. They presented charts and graphs, projections and forecasts, a blizzard of data that was designed to impress and intimidate. Abigail listened patiently, her sketchbook open in front of her. She didn't say a word for the first 2 hours. The executives exchanged smug, knowing glances. The child was out of her depth, just as they had expected. Then, they came to the main item on the agenda, a proposal to acquire a smaller, rival company. It was a classic Montgomery move, a hostile takeover that would create a monopoly in the market, but would also result in the closure of several factories and the loss of thousands of jobs. The executives presented the plan with a cold, clinical efficiency, their voices devoid of any emotion. It was just business. When they had finished, there was a moment of silence. Preston looked down the table at Abigail. "Do you have any questions?" he asked, his voice neutral. All eyes turned to the small, blonde girl. She looked up from her sketchbook. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I do." She pointed to a line on the financial projection. "This number here," she said. "The one that says synergies. What does that mean?" The chief financial officer, a man with a booming voice and an oversized ego, chuckled condescendingly. "That's a technical term, young lady," he said. "It refers to the cost savings we'll achieve by eliminating redundant positions." "You mean firing people?" Abigail said. The CFO's smile faltered. "Well," he stammered, "yes. I suppose you could put it that way." Abigail turned a page in her sketchbook. She had drawn a simple diagram. It wasn't a financial chart. It was a chessboard. "You see this company you want to buy," she said, "as a pawn. A piece that you can sacrifice to improve your position. You take it off the board, and you get stronger." She looked around the table, her gaze meeting the eyes of each executive in turn. "But you're forgetting something," she said. "That pawn is not just a piece of wood. It's a whole army. It's the workers in the factories. It's their families. It's the small towns that depend on those jobs. You take that pawn off the board, and you're not just losing a piece. You're destroying a kingdom." She slid her sketchbook across the table to Preston. "There's a better move," she said. "Instead of taking them over, why don't we invest in them? Help them modernize their factories. Help them develop new products. Help them become a stronger competitor." The executives stared at her, dumbfounded. The idea was absurd. It was financial suicide. It was heresy. But Preston looked at the chessboard she had drawn. He saw the logic in her move, the quiet, patient wisdom that had defeated him so many months ago. He saw a way to win, not by destroying his opponent, but by making them an ally. He looked up at the board. "She's right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not buying them. We're partnering with them. Draw up a new proposal. And this time, I want the word synergies replaced with the word people." That day, something shifted in the soul of Montgomery Industries. The old guard grumbled, but a new era had begun. The company started to invest in its employees, in its communities, in long-term sustainability rather than short-term profits. It was a slower, more difficult path, but it was a better one. And slowly, miraculously, the bottom line began to improve. Happy employees were productive employees. Loyal communities were loyal customers. A company with a conscience was a company that people wanted to do business with. Years passed. The Frank Miller Foundation grew, its roots spreading across the country, a quiet, steady force for good. Susan Miller, the once timid housekeeper, became a confident, respected philanthropist, a woman who moved with ease in a world of power and influence, but never forgot where she came from. One day, a letter arrived at the foundation's office. It was from a small, family-owned woodworking shop in Oregon. The owner, a man named George, was on the brink of bankruptcy. A large, multinational corporation had moved into his town, undercutting his prices and driving him out of business. He had poured his life's savings into his shop. It had been in his family for 3 generations. He was about to lose everything. Susan read the letter, and her heart ached. It was her own family's story, repeating itself in a different time, a different place. She flew to Oregon to meet him. She saw the pride in his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the love he had for his craft. The foundation gave him a grant. It was not a handout, but a hand up. They helped him modernize his equipment, develop a website, find new markets for his handcrafted furniture. They gave him a fighting chance. A year later, Susan received another letter from George. His business was thriving. He had hired 3 new employees. His son, who had gone off to college to study business, had decided to come home and join the family firm. "You didn't just save my shop," George wrote, his words blurred by tears. "You saved my family. You saved my legacy." Susan put the letter down, a quiet, satisfied smile on her face. This was her victory. This was her checkmate. On a warm, summer evening, 5 years after that fateful game of chess, Preston Montgomery stood on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, looking out at the glittering skyline of the city. He was an old man now, his hair completely white, his face etched with the lines of a life that had been both hard and full. He heard a soft footstep behind him. He turned and saw Abigail. She was 14 now, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. She had her mother's kind eyes and her grandfather's quiet, unwavering strength. She had just been accepted to a prestigious university with a double major in economics and philosophy. She was still on the board of his company, a guiding voice of reason and compassion. She was, he knew, the future. "Look at it, Abby," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "All those lights, all those people. I spent my whole life trying to conquer this city, to own it, to put my name on every building." He shook his head. "I was such a fool. I was playing a game of checkers, and I thought it was chess." "You're a good man, Preston," Abigail said, standing beside him. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "No," he said, "I'm not. But you've made me a better one." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the city breathe, a living, pulsing thing. "Do you ever miss it?" Preston asked. "The fight? The thrill of the win?" Abigail thought for a moment. "The game is never over," she said. "It just changes. The goal isn't to win anymore. It's to play a beautiful game. A game that leaves the board and the world a better place than you found it." She looked up at him, her blue eyes shining with a wisdom that was far beyond her years. "Grandpa taught me that," she said. "He said that every pawn is a potential queen. Every person is a potential hero. You just have to give them a chance to make it to the other side." Preston looked out at the endless, sprawling city, at the millions of tiny lights, each one a story, a dream, a game waiting to be played. And for the first time in his life, he didn't see a kingdom to be conquered. He saw a world to be saved. And he knew, with a deep and abiding certainty, that the game was in good hands. The child had become a queen, and her reign was just beginning. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.